Welcome to today's lesson on the origins of life on Earth. So before we get into some details, let's talk a little bit about the history of Earth. Earth first formed about 4.6 billion years ago. When it formed, it was a ball of molten rock, and obviously nothing was alive there. There weren't even liquid oceans at that point. As it gradually started to cool, gases escaped from the crust, forming a primitive atmosphere, and as it got cool enough for liquid water to form, you started to have oceans. So what we're going to talk about is how you got from this to this. The Earth today is it's very different from what it was and closer to its formation. And a large part of the change has been the origins of life on Earth. Life has created such visible changes that you can even see them from space. We can see the greenery of forests from space. We can see vegetation from space as well. And life has had other subtler impacts on the planet as well. We'll talk about those more when we get to talk about ecology and a little bit about the timeline of life on Earth as well. We also went from something a little more difficult to see. At the molecular level, we went from these very simple molecules, things like molecular nitrogen, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane, to much more complex molecules like what you see here. So all three of these are different views of a structure called a nucleosome. A nucleosome consists of a protein core, like what you see in the center here, with DNA wrapped around it. So this right here is DNA wrapped around a protein. These are very complex structures. It's part of how our DNA is packaged inside of our cells. And they're a very, very dramatic difference from these very simple molecules that you see on the left. So how did we go from really simple, tiny molecules to super complex, highly organized molecules? That's what we're going to discuss in this lesson. So that leads us to abiogenesis, or the abiotic origins of life on the planet. So if we look at the kind of gases that probably existed in Earth's primitive atmosphere, you'll find that while some of the components are very similar, like molecular nitrogen, as well as some methane, you will find also water vapor is there as well, because this is after the formation of oceans. You'll find that there are some big differences. For example, there was ammonia in the early atmosphere, there was carbon monoxide in the early atmosphere, there was hydrogen gas in the early atmosphere, and then also there was a much larger amount of carbon dioxide. This is dramatically different from the current atmosphere that we have in the air, current mix of gases that we have in the air today. So there were different compounds in the air, and as these compounds were floating around in the air, they might run into each other and then react to form different compounds, kind of like the different compounds you see here. So these things are reacting with each other, and then they're forming these molecules at the bottom, and those are very simple organic molecules. Now, any sort of chemical reaction requires an energy input. This can be supplied by heat, basically the energy of molecules whizzing through the air and bumping into each other. It can be supplied by a sudden source, something like lightning or some sort of fire. It can be coupled with energy releasing reactions, or the amount of energy that's required to perform a chemical reaction can be reduced by enzymes. Obviously, there weren't any enzymes, there weren't any living things for these reactions to happen, so they had to happen by these kind of spontaneous processes, either heat energy or lightning, and they probably happened fairly slowly. But as molecules were colliding with each other and becoming more complex, they were able to form some basic precursors of organic molecules, like the methyl formate, the glycolaldehyde, the ethanol, and the dimethyl ether that you see there. None of those are really compounds that you'll find in super large amounts in our bodies, but they are precursors to the more complex molecules. And my apologies for all the yawning. It's late. I'm tired. So there were a number of steps that were necessary for life to arise on the planet. And like I said, these probably happened very gradually, one step happening at a time, building upon each innovation that came before it to create more and more complex structures. So first of all, molecules had to have the ability to copy themselves. You can have some molecules floating around in the atmosphere and the ocean, but if they can't make more of themselves, then you're not really going to have eventually life. They have to be able to put themselves together, at least initially, because there were no enzymes, there were no protein complexes, and all of the things that help put together molecules inside our bodies. They needed to be able to perform autocatalysis. Catalysis is the performing of chemical reactions to build or destroy molecules, and the earliest forms of proto-life or pre-life had to be able to control these chemical reactions. Uncontrolled chemical reactions are not really conducive to living creatures. And then you had to have some sort of boundary emerge between any of these precursor cells and the external environment. The environment inside of our cells is very different to the external environment. This is true of any living organism, and so you have to have a boundary to separate it. And so this would be the emergence of any sort of cell membrane or other sort of permeable boundary thing that would let things in and out of these protocells. So scientists have actually made sorts of protocells in the lab. They're self-organized, they tend to be spherical, and they're very simple. The one that you see here has basically ribonucleases, so they're RNA that can actually perform chemical reactions, sort of like an enzyme, and it also has a coating of a phospholipid bilayer. So this is perhaps a very primitive example of what might have eventually led to life. You have the ribonucleases. They're capable of transmitting genetic information. They're also capable of acquiring mutations. Mutations are necessary for life to develop because that's how life changes and becomes and gains the ability to become better adapted to its environment. So the cell membrane, or this phospholipid bilayer, is forming a boundary that does allow certain substances in and out of this protocell, and it has to be able to replicate as well. So what we're going to look at are some of the hypotheses on how biomolecules first started to originate, which is one of those major steps in the origins of life. So one of the first ones was developed by Alexander Oparin and John Haldane. Sometimes it's called the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis, which is why I included the names of the major scientists involved. So there's a hypothesis is called the primordial soup hypothesis, that there was an oxygen-poor early atmosphere, but there were things that were able to supply energy like lightning or even ultraviolet radiation, which back in an oxygen-poor atmosphere would not be blocked because there would be no ozone to block it from hitting the Earth's surface. So with these in combination, they could form various basic organic compounds, which could form these aggregates or kind of these buildups of molecules, including coacervates like we were observed in our Origins of Life lab. And in an aqueous or watery environment, they could absorb various organic compounds, they could grow, they could even replicate. And so this hypothesis says that the early oceans were kind of this soup of a mixture of organic chemicals, and that those organic chemicals interacting with each other would eventually lead to the emergence of these very complicated biomolecules. The supporting evidence is going to be talked about on our next slide, and that is the Miller Urey experiment. There are some contradicting pieces of evidence, though, that we're still not 100% certain what the composition of the primitive atmosphere was, so we can't make definite claims about what gases were in the atmosphere and what organic compounds they could have formed. Also, once you got these simple organic compounds, polymerization reactions would be a little more difficult, and polymerization reactions would be like dehydration synthesis, forming more complex polymers from simple monomers. So let's look at the kind of big piece of evidence for the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis, and that was the Miller Urey experiment. So Stanley Miller and Harold Urey were trying to replicate conditions on early Earth, and they were trying to use that to basically observe whether or not organic compounds could come from abiotic processes. So they had this whole complicated apparatus that was set up, and it included a mix of gases that are thought to have composed the early atmosphere. Then it also included a source of water vapor and a liquid form of water to mimic the early oceans, and that water was evaporated, and the mix of atmospheric gases was hit with a spark of electricity meant to simulate lightning, and also to provide energy for chemical reactions to happen. And they let this happen over and over again. They let this experiment run for a while, and then they would periodically remove liquid that condensed from this apparatus. When they tested it, they found a number of very simple organic molecules, including some of the basic amino acids that make up our proteins today. So it is a very foundational experiment in early biochemistry to study the origins of life. And while nowadays the prevailing hypothesis is that the composition of the early atmosphere is very different from what Miller and Urey tested, more modern experiments with our kind of better estimate of the composition of the early atmosphere still yields organic compounds. So it is possible that this type of a reaction could have produced early simple organic molecules. There's another set of hypotheses called the RNA World Hypothesis. Remember, we need some sort of genetic material to create these heritable sets of molecules. And so Alexander Rich and Walter Gilbert, by the way, they're not super highly associated with the name of this, so you won't see their names referred to on the AP exam. It's usually called the RNA World Hypothesis. They observed that you can actually have some complicated RNAs, or relatively simple RNAs actually, that can perform chemical reactions. So they can catalyze reactions just like enzymes do, including the production of more of these RNA molecules. And they coined the term ribozymes to describe these. So ribozymes are enzymes that are made of RNA instead of protein. So their hypothesis is that since RNA had this ability to catalyze chemical reactions, that it probably was the first form of nucleic acid and the first form of enzyme that existed. Because if you look at our system of DNA that carries genetic information and codes for proteins and leads to the production of proteins, what you'll see is that it's a super complicated process that requires a number of steps. Instead, it kind of makes more sense that a simpler process would have evolved first, that RNA, which was capable of performing more than one role, was the originator of the original progenitor of nucleic acids. However, DNA is more stable than RNA, and so it gradually came to replace the RNA as the genetic coding molecule for life. There is evidence that this must have happened early in the development of life. Basically, the fact that all organisms living on the planet today use DNA as their genetic material. So, some supporting evidence of this: there are ribozymes that act in cells today, and ribosomes have a very large portion of their structure made up of RNA, and they're still able to catalyze chemical reactions, specifically the synthesis of proteins. Now, there is some contradicting evidence for this. As of right now, there's no known abiogenetic pathway to create cytosine and uracil, which are two of the bases found in RNA. And ribose sugars are less stable than deoxyribose sugars. They may not be stable enough to be a long-term genetic material. And then finally, a lot of people's favorite, the extraterrestrial origins hypothesis, and that was kind of put forth by Chandra Vikram Singh. And his hypothesis was that basically a lot of the organic molecules that were the precursors to original life formed in outer space, where you have You have asteroids, you have meteors, you have bodies colliding with each other, which produces a lot of energy, which could drive the formation of more complex molecules. And they were on meteors and comets that bombarded Earth very early in its history. And once they struck the Earth and landed on Earth, they were able to undergo reactions to form more complex organic molecules. What is the evidence of this? Well, there have been meteorites that have hit Earth, and when scientists have studied them, they have found that there were simple organic molecules on those meteorites. So there is evidence that these organic compounds can form in space. The problem is it's difficult to test this experimentally, to simulate meteorites hitting the Earth in large quantities and then gradually over time producing more complex organic molecules. So there is no a kind of set hypothesis that's been widely accepted, and quite honestly, there's the distinct possibility that some organic compounds came to Earth on meteors, so there might be some support for the extraterrestrial origins. There've been many experiments done and many hypotheses laid out for the origins of various components of cells, so that would encompass the RNA World Hypothesis. There are sets of experiments that examine how protocell membranes could have formed and how they could have actually gotten organic compounds inside of them, and those are based on research that looks at an aquatic origin of life. The first life on the planet did evolve in the oceans, and so there's a pretty strong case there for life having first evolved in the oceans and them having a large role in the evolution of life. We'll explore this much more in detail when we talk about evolution later in the year. And that's it for